First thing we want to do is to check the solution temperatures. When you're doing conductivity measurements are temperature sensitive. So we're going to check the temperature of our calibration standards and also of our discharge samples. Make sure that they're within plus or minus 1 or 2 degrees of one another. Reading about 70 degrees Fahrenheit. .70 Fahrenheit. .70. About 69. And about 69. We'll check the water temperature. Our water temperature is a little colder than that. We're reading about 60 degrees Fahrenheit. We'll let that warm up a little bit. Using the conductivity meter, we first need to adjust the sensitivity. We're going to be reading conductance in microsiemens per centimeter. Setting the sensitivity, we'll set it to the times 100 position that it's set now. And we'll turn the instrument to the on position. We'll first do the 2% premix. And when I'm doing this, I'm also stirring slightly the conductivity probe in the solution. And we'll wait until it stabilizes.
Good, 5.65.
5.65?
Yep.
Okay. Next, our 3% calibration standard.
7.20.
7.20. And lastly, our 4% calibration standard. 8.90. .47. First discharge sample number 1. .75. Discharge sample number 2. 770. Now again, we'll create our calibration curve. We're using a conductivity meter, model 1500-32. Create the scale on the y-axis of percent concentrate. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. On the y-axis, I'm going to create meter reading. I'm going to make it 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Water is reading 1.47, so 0% would be 1.47, which is here. 2% was reading 5.65, which is here. 3% was reading 7.20, which is here. 4% was reading 8.90, which is here. Drawing the best straight line through the 3 points. We have this calibration curve. Marking the values that we achieved. We got discharge sample number 1 was 7.75, which is here. That equates to 3.3%. Discharge sample number 2 was reading 7.70. Which is here, which in essence is reading the same concentration. Both discharge sample number 1 and 2 tested out at 3.3% concentration. One of the disadvantages with conductivity is that you cannot use it if you had a system that was using seawater or brackish water. And there are some advantages from a standpoint of flexibility on doing different measurements, such as with the concentrate, that many times makes using a refractometer a more desirable method.
Foam concentrate measurement procedures. Depending on the Ansul equipment provided, 2 methods are acceptable for estimating the foam concentrate within your Ansul bladder tank. One is using the sight gauge. The other is using a dipstick or line. Both methods are appropriate for either horizontal or vertical bladder tanks, but keep in mind neither method is exact. Instead, both methods of measurement will provide a close estimate of the bladder contents. The following measurements will provide an estimate of the amount of concentrate remaining in the tank after operation. The approximate quantity of gallons or liters required to refill the bladder can be determined by subtracting the table reading, concentrate in the tank, from the capacity specified on the tank nameplate. The percentage of concentrate to be replaced can be determined by dividing the number of gallons or liters required to refill the tank by the rated capacity specified on the tank nameplate. If the percentage of concentrate to be replaced is more than 25%, a major refill is required. Otherwise, Ansul recommends following the instructions for a minor refill of the bladder tank when less than 25% of the concentrate needs to be replaced. Foam concentrate measurement procedures. Sight gauge measurement. First, you need to close the water inlet valve. The next step is to open the tank shell drain valve and tank shell vent valve until all of the water is drained and all pressure is relieved from the tank. Pull the ring pin and turn the sight gauge valve handle to the read position. Allow the concentrate to enter and arrive at a stable level in the sight gauge tube. Next, you'll need to measure and record the concentrate depth in the sight gauge tube. The measurement must be taken from the tube connector at the top of the valve body to the concentrate level in the sight gauge tube shown here. Now, return the sight gauge valve to the operating position. Insert the ring pin and install the visual inspection seal. The concentrate will automatically drain from the sight gauge tube at this time. If your bladder tank capacity is below system requirements, your tank must be refilled. Close the tank shell drain valve and slowly open the water inlet valve to vent the air between the bladder and the tank shell. Finally, close the tank shell vent valve. You've now successfully used the sight gauge method to measure the foam concentrate within your Ansul bladder tank. Foam concentrate measurement procedures using a dipstick line measurement.
There's actually two methods that can be used. You can use the liquid level gauge, and another way of doing it is you can run a tape measure
down the center of
down
that.
through the top of the tank. I'll demonstrate that.
Oh, okay, and then what you would do is go to the measuring chart here in the back.
Oh, you'd stick it all the way to
Yeah,
the bottom?
yep, all the way to the bottom.
It'll tell you how many inches you'd have.
Right, and then you see where it's wet. Then you go to your measuring guide, okay? And here's your 400, and if you're wet at 50 inches, well, I got
Is this the diameter?
Yep, that's your diameter, 48
That's
inch.
a gallon, okay.
Right. And here's, 332 gallons is what you'd be if you were wet at 50 inches. If you're wet at 59 or 60, you got 400, maybe 402 in there, something like that.
Okay, Roger, right now we have the tape measure right down till it hits the bottom flange at the bottom of the tank. Okay? Now, if I retract the tape measure
Track it
slowly,
to see where it's wet.
and what I'm feeling for here is for when the tape measure gets wet. Okay, it's wet right here. Looks like it's about 54 inches.
And we said 53 and a half before, didn't we?
Yep.
So we can measure, we can actually measure two different ways.
To do it.
Well, that'd be a good way just to see, just
Right.
see right on.
Right.
You know?
So either way.
Right. And that's called a dipstick method, or half-inch tape measure works the best. Because with some types of foam concentrates, now this one goes up the sight gauge freely, but there's some types of foam concentrates that are thick, more viscous. And the liquid level goes up so slowly up the sight gauge tube that you don't get an accurate reading.
And so then we don't even put one of these on.
We don't even recommend
What
a
we do
sight
then
gauge
is
in that case.
then
We
we
ought to always
recommend
recommend.
Minor or partial refill, instructions and procedures. A minor refill is required when less than 25% of the concentrate must be replaced within the bladder tank. Before you proceed with your minor or partial refill, Ansul recommends performing a complete inspection of your Ansul bladder tank system. If the system was partially discharged, make sure to turn off the water pressure to the bladder tank. Next, slowly open the tank shell vent valve to relieve pressure. Now that the pressure is relieved, fully open the tank shell drain valve. Open the bladder vent fill valve and allow all of the water to drain from around the outside of the tank shell bladder. Make sure you use either the liquid level sight gauge or dipstick method to determine the amount of foam concentrate needed. Refer to the bladder tank measurement guide to determine the amount of agent required. Now you can partially refill the bladder tank. Make sure the water inlet valve and the concentrate isolation valve are closed. Open the pump valve and prime the pump with concentrate, then close the pump valve. Now connect the concentrate pump and valve to the bladder drain fill valve. Again, only the Ansul foam concentrate specified on the tank nameplate may be pumped into the bladder. Next, start the concentrate pump, open the pump valve, and build up the pump pressure. Slowly open the bladder drain fill valve and start pumping the concentrate into the bladder until the amount of concentrate stamped on the tank nameplate has been pumped into the bladder. Close the bladder drain fill valve and disconnect the concentrate pump. Return the bladder tank valve handles to the following operating positions. Water inlet valve, open. Tank shell drain valve, closed. Bladder drain fill valve, closed. Tank shell vent valve, closed. Bladder vent fill valve, closed. Concentrate isolation valve, normal operating position. If provided, sight gauge valve operating. Next, insert the ring pins through the valve handles into the brackets and install visual inspection seals. Finally, record the date of the minor refill and notify any operating personnel that the system is back in service. Now you have successfully completed a minor or partial refill of Ansul's bladder tank. Major refill, instructions and procedures. A major refill is required when more than 25% of the concentrate must be replaced within the bladder tank. Before you proceed with the initial fill, Ansul recommends performing a complete inspection of your Ansul bladder tank system. To refill the bladder tank, first close the water inlet valve and the concentrate isolation valve. Next, slowly open the tank shell vent valve to relieve the water pressure. Now open the tank shell drain valve until all of the water is drained and all pressure is relieved from the tank. Once the water has drained from the tank, place the bladder tank valve handles in the following positions: water inlet valve, closed; tank shell drain valve, closed; bladder drain fill valve, closed; tank shell vent valve, closed; bladder vent fill valve, open; concentrate isolation valve, closed; and, if provided, sight gauge valve, operating. Next, connect the vacuum hose to the tank shell vent valve by using pipe fittings and securing with duct tape. Now connect the vacuum hose to the shop vac and start the vacuum. Note the high-pitched sound from the vacuum before opening the valve. This will be the same pitch heard in the steps to come. Once you've activated the vacuum, open the tank shell vent valve to pull the air out between the bladder and the tank shell, which will pull the bladder out to the tank shell wall. Once you've heard the change in pitch from the vacuum, the bladder is completely pulled out to the tank shell wall. Next, open the pump valve and prime the pump with concentrate, then close the pump valve. Now, connect the concentrate pump to the bladder drain fill valve. Again, only the Ansul foam concentrate specified on the tank nameplate may be pumped into the bladder. Start the concentrate pump, open up the pump valve, and then open up the bladder drain fill valve. Now you can proceed to fill the bladder tank with concentrate. At this point, the only valves that should be open are the pump valve, the bladder drain fill valve, and the bladder vent fill valve, which is venting the air being displaced by the foam concentrate. Ansul recommends that when a bladder tank is initially filled, or when requiring a refill in the field, that the nameplate from the 55-gallon drum be removed and pasted to the sidewall shell of the foam tank in a prominent location. This label displays the Ansul part number of the foam agent, the lot number, and the date of manufacture for possible future reference. Once the bladder tank is filled to the rated capacity stamped on the tank nameplate, close the bladder drain fill valve, shut off the concentrate fill pump, and close the bladder vent fill valve. Disconnect the vacuum hose from the tank shell vent valve. Disconnect the concentrate fill pump from the bladder drain fill valve. Now return the bladder tank valve handles to the following operating positions: water inlet valve, open; tank shell drain valve, closed; bladder drain fill valve, closed; tank shell vent valve, closed; bladder vent fill valve, closed; concentrate isolation valve, normal operating position. If provided, sight gauge valve, operating. Next, insert the ring pins through the valve handles into the brackets and install visual inspection seals. Finally, record the date of the major refill and notify any operating personnel that the system